All right. All right, let's kick this off. So thank you guys for joining us today. So today we're going to be talking about all of this data that we've got in different types of areas, and where are these flying cars that we were promised? This old cliche that we've got, especially here in Silicon Valley, that with all of the technology that we've got, at what point do we get these cool personal robots and personal AIs and so on and so forth? So I'm very grateful to have you three here with me, Kathy, Vic, and Martina. So thank you guys for joining me. So we'll kind of kick this off and we'll keep this quite casual and light. So if there are any questions or any comments as we're going through and kind of just discussing the state of personal data, the state of data overall, and what we expect in the future, then please do pop these into comments, for example, on Twitter or YouTube or and anywhere in general, and we can gladly come back to those later. But how about we kick this off this way, that I would love to just do like a very quick fire kind of context in terms of who we all are, just so that we can kind of set the stage. And then from there, we can dive into some of these topics that we've got here on the agenda. So why don't we start off first of all with you, Vic, in terms of just who you are and what type of things you are working on overall here. And Vic, you're on mute.
Thank you. Very nice to be here today. Thank you for organizing this, Marcus. My name is Vic Kashyap. I'm the founder and CEO of Toy Labs. We've developed a very unique bathroom technology. It involves a toilet seat that monitors stool and urine from a home setting in order to understand more about human health. As you can imagine, we are dealing with a very sensitive and private information. And also, it's a very new type of health and wellness information that we're collecting from a home environment in consumers' homes. Nice to be here today.
Mhm. Awesome. And then Kathy, how about you go next?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Marcus. My name is Kathy Jory. I'm currently on the commercial side working for Zadata.com, which does secure cloud orchestration of edge nodes for big industrial, massive operations, stuff like that, and trying to take advantage of that technology. But on the personal side, I was more recently at Mozilla with this Web Things project, and I just got to say that my heart is in the consumer side. Privacy is really important. Like IoT and industry is really booming. Let's take advantage of that. The technology bringing the cost down, and I can run a Raspberry Pi in my home. And even though I'm not home, I can have a little web browser on my phone or wherever and manage my home. And it's all running on my Raspberry Pi. My Pi is the cloud. It has no dependency on processing or storing data in anybody else's cloud. It's just in my home. So those are the two sides of the IoT world that have very different use cases in terms of the data, where it's being processed and stored, and the privacy around that data.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. And Martinez, let's round out with you.
So I'm Martinez Bieliūnas, managing partner of Privacy Partners. And our main task each day is to build innovative privacy programs for our customers. In my backbone, I'm a technologist. So all my life, I'm with information technology, 16 years of Microsoft. So that was a good background to start business around privacy, around compliance. And on my hobby side, we're very interested about information security as well. So how to make our life in this information technologies age and space private, secure, and reliable. So that's it in short.
Awesome. And then from my point of view, I'm the glorified MC here for our discussion. In my day-to-day, I run Perfina with Paul, who's helped us put together this event. And what we're doing really is kind of trying to reimagine how we deal with data. That instead of us always shipping our data to app developers and external servers, why can't we just retain it and then essentially bring the applications to us? And that's something where we're developing practical protocols to actually make that happen. But you guys all touched on super interesting areas. So let's kind of just go a little bit deeper into those. I think there's kind of an interesting, let's say, different kind of puzzle pieces here. Like on one side, Vic, you're dealing with sensitive data, incredibly rich data as well, and such that has incredible personal value to us in terms of our own health and well-being. At the same time, then approaching that data, for example, with HIPAA and all sorts of different kind of security considerations, and that's probably got a lot of different nuance to that. Why don't we start there and kind of then go from like, how do we deal with very sensitive data to then our own homes and then the overall market in terms of like what are, let's say, some of the limitations of current setup in the market. But Vic, kind of what's your own experience working with this data so far? That what is the perception around this, and especially kind of, let's say, as it relates to certain type of data that can be incredibly valuable, then how do you see your customers kind of approaching the privacy utility balance?
Yeah, that's a great question, Marcus. So, as way of background, I've been actually developing telehealth solutions for over a decade. And it's been very interesting to me to see what the pandemic and COVID has done in terms of the accelerant that it's provided in adoption of remote technologies, particularly in a home environment in healthcare. And for us, a lot of what we're doing, I mean, for the challenge for us is we have an application that's never been put into the world. And so, but as you had mentioned, it has the potential to have really significant impacts in terms of understanding at a much deeper level what's going on in your body beyond the tools that are available today. And so for us, when I first got into this business, which was a few years ago, my single biggest concern was really the privacy matter. Would people be willing to accept analysis of their body continuously in the background from their homes? These were pretty fundamental questions, and I think as we've deployed many of these units, we've got customers. We've learned over time that it's a very complicated calculus that a customer has or even a user has about the value of what's being provided versus what they perceive to be the privacy trade-offs. Now, in healthcare, there's obviously government regulations that prohibit the disclosure of protected information. But I think even beyond that, when you think about these technologies and how they're becoming closer and closer to the most I would say sacred parts of a person's life, which is their health and what's happening inside their body, you have to address head on these questions about, well, what am I sacrificing by getting the value that this product offers? And we've taken an approach where we want to be extremely clear about the boundaries of who owns this data, how this data is being used, how it potentially could or could not be used against you, and addressing these questions head on, because I think it's just a matter of time. You look at the world of what Google and Microsoft and Apple and Facebook can get from you in an online profile, but we're moving to a world where products like ours are going to even get to a deeper level of understanding about you as a human being. And so I think getting ahead of this is critical.
Yeah, there's a couple of fantastic points there. And I feel it's like also when you look at different types of personal devices, like for example, let's take wearables, you have this very clear, of course, separation between medical and clinical grade data, and then kind of this, let's say, personal device data, and so on and so forth. But it's very interesting because it is individual first in that sense that it's not coming from an enterprise system, it's coming from you. And you can even tell this like even from our own small developer community, you can see this type of reaction where individuals really do want this insight and this agency from their data. Like they want to be able to, for example, sleep better or manage their stress better, or whatever it is. And you have all the pieces of the puzzle. But then there is this kind of threshold at some point where you notice that your use cases, they get limited if you go into this type of a question that you have to share something that you're actually maybe not comfortable sharing. And it is in a way, we kind of often think that there has to be something that's not a win-lose, but a win-win, where you can kind of get to the outcome without sacrificing or essentially balancing it with some type of a risk to you. And that's something that I'm sure that comes up time and time again. Kathy, you mentioned or you showed this personal device or kind of your own personal remote to your home. How do you kind of view this from, let's say, a utility point of view? Because you and I, we've talked in the past about different types of things that you've set up in your own home and what we as individuals can set up. But how do you kind of view this, let's say, 5 years out in terms of what type of things, we'll almost have to figure out in order to get where we need to go?
Well, I think what your company is doing is really interesting because I'll just show you the entry door. So I opened up a log to a door and a motion sensor, and you see this data where these are just binary sensors, right? You see the data, and then it stops. Well, because I left the house and I'm not actually there, somewhere else. And these data are important to me from a privacy perspective, but I don't want other people to know because they'd know I'm not home and you could break in if it were exposed to the dark web. However, when you talk about my desire for benefits based on those data from a commercial standpoint, say my refrigerator, if the door is left open, it can alert me or beep, and that's information that's really relevant to me. I don't need a call center to help me realize, how to fix my door open. But if the filter goes bad, if something breaks, then I want sort of those outside external operation little elements to be able to be acted upon. And that's when, what you said is, I have the data, but I want your application to come to me, intercept certain data from my refrigerator and tell me what's wrong, or identify the part I need to replace or ship it, or, so that's where the fine line of we need to expose the data like visibly to the user. And even Vic, in your case, like show me the data and then show me what the application data looks like from a layman's point of view. So I know what I'm giving up. What am I telling the experts from these data? What are they learning from me? Just to make sure the users are comfortable with that. At least that's my perspective. I want to know what I'm giving up when I am working with this application. What is this application? And then what does the application do for me? How do I value from it? Gain value.
And maybe kind of skip back to you, Vic, before we kind of go into the broader ecosystem, because I think there's an interesting question that came to my mind from the way that you, Kathy, laid it out, that you have essentially the hardware, and then you have the personal connection. But then there is the argument for data portability, that if you were to be able to essentially, let's say, open this data up, of course, in a privacy protected way, but if you were able to essentially, give this utility to the individual, that essentially other types of applications could utilize this data too for different types of use cases that you're not mapping it for example. How do you think about kind of that, let's say, the initial areas that you're focused on, and then let's say the reasonable portability applications that you could see kind of from that type of ecosystem emerging?
Yeah, so if you look at an application like ours, we're developing. We have it's a new type of toilet seat. It simply installs onto the hardware itself. Is a replacement on someone's existing dumb toilet seat that is just a piece of plastic that they sit on. And our product connects via Wi-Fi over a secure channel and sends the information that we're analyzing into a cloud-based environment. And for us, as we think about the portability, so as you step back, it's very important that people understand what the purpose of a product like ours is. In our case, it's really designed to be a sentry, a 24/7 continuous background system that doesn't need to be recharged. There needs to be no change in behavior. And so it's essentially providing this 24/7 sentry service that you don't really need to engage with. There is really no engagement in our particular system, and that it gets into what we think is more of the future of sensor technology, which is more ambient in healthcare as opposed to needing to require engagement and user interaction. And so when you think about it in that sense, for us, we have a different paradigm in terms of how we think about this in terms of the consumption and portability of data. So the data that we're analyzing and collecting can be used in a variety of different ways. But at the end of the day, we try to keep it very simple in that this is data that belongs to the individual. At the end of the day, it's part of their health record. It's part of their medical history. And so when we start with that kind of a lens, it becomes very clear what the pathways are and how that information can be shared, how it can be utilized, and it's conformant with the way we currently think about healthcare, which is that my healthcare information belongs to me. Of course, it's difficult to share it today, and that's a whole nother problem. But from a portability standpoint and an ownership standpoint, that's where it really begins with a product like ours.
Can I interject with an idea? It just caught my head. You mentioned that you have these sensors on the toilet seat, but for Marcus's question, like what if there's an additional sensor that knows or that identifies some sort of water flow sounds or something like that, and the user can decide to like let me know when there's a leak in the toilet, like it's constantly leaking or something like that. It has nothing to do with my personal health, but just saying that, for Marcus's point, maybe allow the end user to share that data with them only. In this case, it's probably something I only need to know, but maybe the water department wants to know that my toilet's not leaking and I get rebates based on it, some other value. It's just, we're talking about toilets, these are just kind of weird, but you get the idea,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is these kind of externalities, which maybe outside of healthcare or incidental findings are I think part and parcel of what like almost every IoT company in the home has to address. Because what do you do if you find something that you should inform? What is your duty to inform? These kind of questions. At what level of should you have a microphone that's listening for a water leak? There's a whole bunch of questions that arise in these kinds of situations.
Well, I because IoT is so unique, like the use case of there's wildfires near me and I want to know when to close the door, and I'm checking the outside, air quality, so I know not to have doors and windows open for that point. But if all these data are pushed together, then we have that compliance privacy nightmare of all these different applications. Segue.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating in terms of how you're basically forcing different types of organizations, different types of actors to kind of think about these things in a, let's say, broader way than only themselves. Like when Vic, you described that when you start with the individual, that this is the individual's data, it's part of their health record, and it's ultimately something that has a continuum for the individual and essentially their care over time, then it's kind of, in a way, I could see it very logically that it's not about sharing data externally. It's rather that effectively, if you had different ways yourself to read that data, to get triggered, to get warnings, and so on and so forth. Like I look at this in a very, very selfish way that I would love to have, for example, more of my own data that I would be able to get some type of, let's say, cues from. Like, for example, if I were to somehow use my 23andMe data and then combine it with something. But then at the same time, I'm not comfortable sharing that with anybody. Like that would have to be retained with me. But let's kind of step more into that segue in terms of the ecosystem. And Martinez, I would love to kind of just touch on a little bit about like the enterprise side, because when we're talking about IoT and when we're talking about devices, then we are oftentimes, we have this privilege of talking about like it from an individual point of view. But this is all really difficult stuff for enterprises. So what's your experience been with kind of going into enterprises and working with them about how to navigate, let's say, this new emerging marketplace or new emerging ecosystem with more and more data?
So talking about enterprises, I would say that typically there is a very huge data disbalance between person or data subject and enterprise. If we take the current social networks, many different ecosystems, typically we know about people more than people know about them. And actually here, this big data disbalance brings us to the very tricky issue. We're coming to the point which is called recording of whole life, because technically it's possible to record all life of each person and even record, as Vic just outlined, some internal parameters. So you can easily build a lie detector using one infrared camera, one usual camera, and that's it. That's enough to detect when a person is lying. Lots of other parameters, lots of physical parameters, a heartbeat, your physical capacity, and so on. So all this data currently, it's not managed well in the enterprises. And actually, when people are saying that, for example, banking systems are secure, or for example, any other systems are secure, I cannot fully agree with it. I mean that many of new systems, many of IoT systems, they are working with newer protocols. They are working with better encryption, and they, in some cases, may be more secure than old style banking systems, because in many of those systems, data is not encrypted at all. So let's say this situation on the enterprise side is very alarming. And in future, it will become even more alarming. For example, with the advance of quantum computing, all the encryption, different encryption algorithms, they may become obsolete. What will happen with all the huge enterprise databases, of all of our financial data, all of our, let's say, personal records, and so on? And generally speaking, even from the philosophical point of view, that means completely different approach to the personal data, completely different architectures, completely different view to the privacy by design in all the systems, in, let's say, all the house management systems, in health systems. And actually, you know, if we take, there is one simple rule. When you separate information from person, it's not possible to ensure full privacy of that information anymore. So we need completely new methods, and that's why for me this concept of personal data cloud is very interesting, because in some sense, person or data subject, as it's called legally, can become, how to say, re-engage in the control of his or her data. And that concept, I think it fits very well with all the advance of Internet of Things, all the advance of new information systems, and that huge, immensely huge data collection which will happen in future.
So maybe I'm too much of an engineer myself, but the way that I think about these enterprise systems is that it's really, really hard to change the existing systems. Like I worked in fintech, and I know some of the banking systems, and you know, those technologies that those were written in, they don't really exist anymore. So starting from changing those and updating it is very difficult. So maybe I'm just too impatient, because our solution at Profina was that let's forget the legacy and let's just create a better way, like a new way. But Martinez, what's your own expectation for the enterprises that, you know, they're trying to catch up to essentially, you know, how to handle data, but how optimistic are you with the things like what should I say? Is it possible for them to essentially catch up and get reorganized properly?
Well, looking what's happening in fintech market, which you just mentioned, some enterprises were showing pretty good agility. For example, if we look to the digital currencies and blockchain, or how it's called technically, it's secure multi-party computation technologies. 2 years ago, it was not accepted in enterprise at all. It was even seen as threat to the enterprises. Now, enterprises jumping very fastly on the bandwagon of new technologies. They are implementing those technologies in, so to say, sandboxes for the data management. And I think, let's say, this overall decentralization movement and the decentralization of computing, it's a right way, and I think on the end of the day, enterprises definitely will embrace it and embed it in their systems, because that's the only way to assure normal privacy in the future. Otherwise, if we just run with a classical old style system, so-called trusted execution environments, which is secured central database, it will not work anymore in future, and that's why enterprises should move faster. They need to increase the rate of adoption of those systems. Otherwise, they can be simply left behind.
I'd love, Kathy, your points on this.
Well, I think it is a tough problem. I do like the decentralization of data and leaving the data where it needs to be. So if you're doing edge processing and analysis, don't bring all the data into a central place, because just like at Mozilla, we didn't want any more personally identifying information than we absolutely needed for the improvement of the product itself. And so, maybe Martinez, when you talk to these enterprise companies, are they of the mindset of just like consume vacuum cleaner data and then we'll figure out what to do with it? Or do they actually consciously think about what privacy, because it's even enterprise privacy. Like, this company has this operational technology and they're doing things in certain ways. A lot of times they don't want competitors to know their efficiencies of scale or their operations management. And you've got some other orchestrator over here manipulating that data that they don't want to unduly expose that information. So whether it's an individual privacy or even a business's privacy matters, the applications that process and store those data, I think you have a tough job of helping those companies design those systems to have privacy by design. Like, do you have a layout for doing that? Like, just a mindset that you describe to them?
Yeah, like actually, from a privacy by design perspective, there are already, principles which stay for many years. I think they are known for almost like 20 years. But I should admit, not many enterprises embraced those principles even with older systems. And the result is that many enterprises, they simply became data cemeteries. And with the advent of privacy legislation, the very huge task for enterprises is just to delete unused data. So to say, sometimes I do see that enterprises, they are engaged in non-productive, non-useful work, instead of orienting all their forces into the new systems, like for example, a system which Vic just explained, collection of bodily parameters of person, collection of really inner parameters or indicators of health. So to say, instead of doing really innovative systems, doing that on the edge where data is collected, enterprises need to clean up their gardens in many cases. But again, I would say that there are some very innovative approaches which we can see. I think privacy protection programs, they are completely in the different stage. After the implementation of GDPR, it was like a wake-up call. All these huge fines, which even biggest players received from data protection authorities, they show that it's not the kids' game anymore. And by the way, privacy is super tough topic. Sometimes people mix privacy with security. For example, I always give an example. The open door, from security perspective, it's 0. If a door is closed, it's 1. So to say, it's secure. With privacy, it's very subjective. Privacy is question of culture, question of context. So to say, for one person, open door can be completely, that's okay. My privacy allows that. For other person, it's non-private setup. So that's very, very tough topic. And for enterprises, the more customers we have, the tougher this topic became. Because when you need to take care about, let's say, 30 million of your customers, each of them have completely different privacy settings, let's say privacy perception. That's a tough job for enterprises. And let's say this situation with edge computing will become, how to say, edge computing may be saving situation, or may make situation even worse, especially when we talk about artificial intelligence. For example, why not to do artificial intelligence on the edge, on the IoT device, which collected, let's say, health data from this application? But then again, I don't know if I would like a situation when, for example, my toilet or my fridge does some decisions for me. It can be tricky situation, and it can be privacy interference. So it's a lots of questions and not many answers now.
How do you view this, Vic, kind of from your point of view, as kind of starting from the individual and starting from the device, and then kind of going from the individual and then the device up into the ecosystem and the value? Then what's your own kind of thought process here?
A lot of, for us, a lot of the path is somewhat, somewhat drawn for us, given that we operate in a medical or healthcare context. And so there are some guideposts related to private and protected healthcare information and what are the legal requirements in order to be able to share that information. But I think from a broader standpoint, I see this as something that requires a very different framework than what is the current approach by companies that are really using and leveraging data. And I think most of the paradigm that regulators are looking at and are being examined in things like GDPR really are predicated on much more advertising specific models that have been pioneered by these FANG companies. And it's my belief that we're reaching a point where these types of approaches are going to change, and they're going to evolve in the type of information that's gathered and the applicability of the data, not just for advertising, but for other applications. In our case, it's really around how do you optimize someone's health? How do you prevent and detect earlier the onset of certain types of diseases? How do you manage someone more effectively in a telehealth context? And I remember conversations that I had even as early as 5 years ago with heads of major insurance companies who said telehealth is never going to happen. It's never going to happen because the privacy issues surrounding video visits in a home setting where someone else might overhear a conversation and that could lead to a fatal breach. Now, that perspective has changed. And I think people are now beginning to understand that there's a lot of benefits that outweigh the risks that executive was talking about 5 years ago. And those risks are willing to, we're willing to overcome those risks and do telehealth. And so as I look at least in healthcare and digital health and telehealth, as I look at where this starts and stops, it really comes down to how are we going to manage our healthcare moving forward? How much of it is going to be in a clinical setting? How much of it is going to be from the home and in a virtual setting? And I think that my perspective on this is that we are going to move inextricably towards the home. It's going to happen. 10 years from now, the healthcare system is going to look very, very different than the way it looks today. And in order to make that migration, there has to be in place some rules of the road. And I think part of the rules are really around starting with ownership of data by the patient. But you also have to remember that sometimes the patient is not in the best position to necessarily make the right decisions about the clinical course of action that they have to take. And so there has to be a balance between the existing doctor-patient relationship, what a doctor orders, what a patient wants and ultimately agrees to, and it's always just by orders of magnitude. Healthcare is the biggest industry in the world, but it's also the most complicated. And so there's just a lot of different constituents that are involved in the delivery and management of healthcare.
No, that's awesome. Thank you for that. And I think you touched on a couple of really, really key things that obviously what we've seen in the last couple of years, that's been a huge transformation and a catalyst for different types of things. Healthcare and telehealth is one. The other one that maybe is interesting to kind of pick up on is, for example, these wearables, which, 2 years ago they were maybe more fringe entertainment devices, and now they're essentially some things. I can't remember how many how many are sold every year. It's like hundreds of millions, outside of the phone, because you could argue that the phone is also a sort of very personal device. But you could also see early detection from these devices. And these, let's be completely clear, these are not clinical grade. These are a lot of the data that comes out of it is very, wacky, and it's very unreliable and uncalibrated and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it doesn't take a very special device to be able to tell changes over time with some type of rough data points. So for example, taking about steps, if somebody's not taking steps, that's an indicator of something. And it's a very binary read by, a very simple device. One of the interesting things, and I'll give you an example. So last year, I tested 2 of these continuous glucose monitoring devices. And I thought that, from a, just a geeky experimentation point of view, then, really cool, that small needle, blood draw, and so on and so forth. I figured out what could be more fun. But I realized then quite quickly that, I'm very fortunate that I'm relatively healthy, and that means that my readings were actually quite boring. That, you'd look at them and they would follow the same type of pattern day in and day out. And then I started thinking that, okay, well, this isn't actually that interesting, that I was really kind of drawn to this. And then I realized that, what do I do with this? Like, but then I started realizing that, and what we've seen from these types of companies that deliver these types of devices, then the roadmap is quite clear, that you start off with this type of reading, this type of sensor data, and then you start combining it with more data. That you start taking, for example, diet. What did the person eat? You start taking sleep. Then you start taking context, like what are they doing? You start taking movement, more and more and more and more data. Now, this is an interesting challenge from, let's say, a use case point of view, which hinges on privacy, which is that you will hit a threshold where essentially the subject, the user, will say that, gee, that all sounded great up until now, but now you're asking me to share, my medical data, and, I don't think so. And I noticed that about myself. And I'm a very utilitarian engineer, like click, click, I will go through anything. But I realize that's a cutoff point for me. And that's probably a cutoff point for many. That once you get to this stage, that you start centralizing more of this critical data with a company that, yes, I mean, you could argue that if you trust that company, but I don't necessarily think that it's that simple, because a lot of folks do trust companies like Microsoft, and a lot of folks do trust their health providers. But there's also the flip side, that there's a lot of folks that don't, and there's a lot of folks that just go for essentially the simplest thing. But kind of going back to the smart home and kind of thinking about this, then how do you see this, Kathy? Because your Raspberry Pi setup is great, but if we're talking about bringing in terabytes of data into that setup, then it's going to start having limitations at some point. And it also kind of hinges on this notion that individuals, there's a smaller population of engineers that will kind of do that themselves. But do you think there's a breaking point here, and how do you think that will develop?
Well, I think there's a gap for the developers who know what data is going where, and that a Zigbee radio is a local only radio and therefore can't be connected to the internet. And I know that, but just like we have lawyers to read legal documents and doctors to tell us our health, we need privacy protection experts to tell consumers to label this device as an internet connected device versus a local data processed, like I want some expertise, whether it starts as a service because it's a manual thing to analyze. It's like an IT specialist for IoT. We need IoT specialists that can analyze from a privacy and a security standpoint. And maybe products get labeled. That goes back to the certification regulation side that we're talking about. I think there's a need for expertise analyzing the products and the data that we're using, in our homes, and then telling us, like Mozilla every Christmas had a privacy not included guide that just took the absolute public information off a website about a product and then created a standard checklist of, Does it have a user policy, privacy thing? Can you delete your, just like check, or uncheck, or, and then they got ratings from good to bad based on these metrics that were just publicly available. Like that type of nutrition information on your food can be the data information on your products that you use. And starting with the home, like, do you want to live in a glass house where everybody sees everything you're doing? I don't think so. And those are the analogies we need to help consumers understand what they're giving away when they use this or expose that data. I mean, that's just the way I see it. And sensor fusion, combining all that, just tells somebody else more and more. But it also, for me, is a real benefit in that I start understanding how I'm doing something, and then I just have the automations. I just deploy some automation. So now those lights turn on automatically at sunset and turn off at a certain time. And if I change my habits, and if I'm away, and the presence indicator, I can have vacation modes just happen automatically. Like, I don't even have to do anything anymore because I'm allowing my local system to interpret things, and I've just set up these rules. But again, those are kind of expert things, and we just need services that help you, set up those automations, save resources. It's just like climate change and saving energy and reducing water usage. There's a lot of downstream benefits for us as in society that we can value, that we can gain great value off of these data and using them the correct way. But it's, we need these nutrition guidelines on the privacy and security of what's collecting it and processing it. That's just my take,
Yeah, but I think I'm kind of just thinking out loud that 100% agree. At the same time, it feels like the impetus is there, because if you take, for example, what Vic is working on, and then you take something that does, for example, continuous glucose monitoring, and then you, for example, take your sleep and your exercise. I mean, I would have incredible utility from that myself. Like, being able to combine them myself, and then being able to get some alerts, like some deviation alerts that, your body's behaving in an odd way or something.
No, which is what I really fully enjoy about managing my own private smart home, is I can have this consumer, this SmartThings button and that IKEA bulb, and I can mix and match. The interoperability is actually from the WebThings as a web layer, so it's all applications just become like web services, and it allows the consumer to do anything they want with it. And you can correlate this to enterprises and industries and so forth. As long as we can form ways to exchange data over APIs, web services, then really the utility, there's a lot of value in that.
I would definitely second Katie's point, because enterprises, I think in future, enterprises will not work in the usual way of centralizing the data. So, for example, taking the data from hundreds of thousands of customers into some central database. Enterprises will just provide a method how to process this data, and data can be processed locally, and this data, as we talked, still can belong to the person. And there is one very important threshold which we definitely need to understand. When person becomes, feels the threat from the collection of personal data. I myself personally start to feel a threat when someone knows more about me than I know myself. And in, let's say, IoT space, it can easily happen. I don't know which devices are tracking me. I don't know which devices which information is collected, and I don't know how this information is combined. And these scenarios, they really can induce a fear in the users, in the consumers. So on that side, if we do show a very transparent ways, nutritional privacy, nutritional labels, as Kathy, you mentioned, that can be a way to kind of decrease the fear, decrease the, let's say, fear for change, and increase the acceptance of IoT technologies, acceptance of advanced medical technologies, such analysis, and let's say our environment analysis. So that definitely can be serious movement forward to the acceptance of privacy in the IoT space.
And per your point on the consumer side, I really want the data to be exposed to the consumer about what that smart home device is doing. It knows your button clicks, or it knows your door is opening, it knows the motion is being detected. I want the consumer to see that data. And then what you said is, for some consumers, oh, I'm okay with sharing that data with a physical security, burglar system provider, or no, I don't want anyone to see that but me. And if you expose the data to the consumer and help them understand what it means, what it says, then they could determine how much privacy, they're willing to share for other valuable services that can crunch that data and do something with it.
Yeah, another thing to add here is I think that wearables, which are really, I would say the first mass adopted consumer wellness set of products, are actually they didn't really start as healthcare or wellness products. I would argue that they started more as fashion. And if you look at where the forces in healthcare lie and the enterprises, the amount of dollars that are involved in managing costs and outcomes, it begins to look very different when, for example, you have a situation where something that's part of a healthcare system, that's part of the traditional healthcare system and its way of addressing disease, addressing cost, addressing outcomes, becomes now, it's not just confined to the traditional clinical setting, and it's moving more towards the home, towards telehealth. I believe you're going to see some very interesting sets of conversations and trade-offs as it relates to the companies and enterprises that are involved in the very, very big business of paying for healthcare, and what is part of what's considered the standard of care with these new digital technologies. And I personally believe there's going to be a significant evolution from where we currently are in the state of wearable devices with where we're heading.
All right, that's fantastic. So, couple observations here, and then I think we can kind of just focus on, let's say, looking into some of those exciting things that we see. We talked about, for example, decentralization already, and I think that that's one of those major things that has a huge tailwind here. But I'd love to kind of come back to each of you and just think about, like, what are the areas that you guys are the most interested in, kind of, where you think we'll see, let's say, the biggest developments in the next 5 years or so. But just a couple of comments. One is kind of around this, let's say, individual end user perception. And I think one of the things that I've been really surprised by, I probably shouldn't have been surprised by, but I have been, is that when iOS 14.5 rolled out, and when folks started asking the user that, do you actually want this? The data is quite clear that most consumers don't actually want data sharing. Like when you go into the advertising business model and you ask a consumer that, do you want company X that you haven't heard of to have access to your data? It's pretty much binary that you don't. Do you want to, be compensated? No, you don't want anything to do with that. That's been one of those surprising things. And I think it raises an interesting hypothesis that if essentially given a choice, then will consumers feel that strongly that, it's not necessarily a trade-off, it's that the consumer doesn't want a trade-off, they want a win-win, that they want essentially all the benefits without essentially that type of give and take. Now, it's of course not always possible that you have that type of outcome in an enterprise setting in particular, where there are various different types of systems. Another thing that I wanted to kind of just thinking about, then there's an interesting thing about sensors. And I think essentially, like we were talking about the product that Vic is working on and the sensors and how that might be used, for example, by the water department or have utility in conjunction with the water department. There's this interesting things about the amount of sensors that we have. And I really believe that if we can make those sensors, if we can essentially make those sensors utilizable by the individual, and then have different types of solutions that come in to equip the individual into using those sensors in different ways, very niche ways, I think that you'll find all sorts of different utility that we're not thinking about yet. And I have this one example that some a brilliant engineer told me that they were looking at how to essentially monitor patient well-care in Italy using IoT. And they were looking at, okay, when they have people in their own homes and they need to make sure that, are the residents okay? Those folks that are in, for example, care homes, like, are they okay? Then they started essentially over-engineering it. They started with all sorts of different entrapments, all sorts of different types of solutions, and so on and so forth. And then there was an older engineer that said that, the fridge has a sensor, that just add a sensor to the fridge. If grandma opens their door, they're okay. And that's it. Like, you don't need to over-engineer it. You can have a very simple sensor in, for example, the fridge door. And if it's open twice a day, then, everything's fine. So I think part of that's also that, you start to have these sensors, but you need to kind of get this ecosystem benefit of how do we actually use them in the home. So that's kind of my let's say, prologue to this, but let's kind of go around the table, so to speak, here, and maybe just talking about smart homes and kind of that space. And Kathy, start off with you, that thinking ahead, what are the things that you're most excited about?
So I think that what excites me is kind of, you laid the groundwork that the instrumentation of the world, or the instrumentation even within my own home, is the starting point. We instrument our areas with sensors, we have data. I'm not going to write all the applications to manipulate all the sensors in my data. So the other thing that's important that I see coming, because the company I'm working for is ZData, is being able to allow any applications, little teeny applications, that manipulate this data with that data, and then later, you could form some action based on that result. Those applications, we need a secure way for the app development world. And this is more like the services world. It's like telling me I have a water leak, or something like the services world, or there's like mice in my shed, or something like that. There's ways of instrumenting my environment to help me do a better job with gardening and pest control and energy savings. And those apps, the world to me is changing, because now we're going to have what's going on in the cloud, where everything becomes this serverless, deploy applications. So think of the app store on your phone in your house. Like, literally, I'll have a bundle of applications doing different things for different reasons, using the same sensors, potentially using a collection of sensors that I have instrumented in my home. And based on that sensor data being available, I get energy savings out of it. I get, automation, vacation settings out of it. I get all these applications. I'm not writing them out. I'm just saying the home is going to become a marketplace for applications, just like this phone is full of sensors and actuators, and there's a whole bunch of apps that, who decided that they could use the phone app to create a flute, and play music out of it? Someone did, right? But that's not what Apple was thinking when they created the iPhone. That's the beauty of it that's coming to me, is like the application richness is going to blow our minds once all of that sensor data can be shared easily, and once you can securely deploy marketplaces of applications anywhere where you have this instrumented environment. That's my sort of long-term view.
Awesome. I mean, Vic, you're also in the home, so let's go to you next in terms of what you're excited about.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we have considered innovative in a home setting to date, things like Amazon Echo, voice portal into the internet, the ability to detect if someone's opened the fridge, being able to set your temperature remotely. These are rather rudimentary types of applications that are not going to define at all what the home of the future is going to look like. And I think we're going to move into a world, and I think it's, our company is hopefully going to play an integral role in creating this world where your home knows very, very detailed information about you and your body, your health, your diet, your children, your way of life. It's going to become a far, far deeper level of intelligence and understanding about you and the environment that you live in. And I think health and wellness is very important to people's lives, and I think we're going to see a lot of advances there in food, in sleep, in management of conditions, in healthcare. I'm very bullish that the home is going to be the place where healthcare happens.
Awesome. Well, Martinez.
Well, I'm extremely excited to hear ideas which I love myself. I think in future, let's say, whole ecosystem will be where sharing economy meets our home. Because let's say currently I think situation is that the home is a little bit disconnected from data. In future, the home will be our personal data cloud, which knows a lot about us, and will be simply connecting the agents, the corporations to that cloud. Okay, one corporation can provide healthcare, another corporation can provide gardening services for my home. Third corporation can provide a home maintenance services for me. And that definitely will happen with privacy in mind, because the data will be kept in our islands, in our personal data clouds. The home will become like a let's say our partner in data management. And I'm really excited about all those decentralized technologies which give a very strong background to implement that realistically, because already now we can start to think about very diverse ecosystem of applications, non-centralized applications which manage different sensors, different types of data, connect different agents, serverless applications to it. So the future is very bright and very diverse here.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for that. And just to kind of riff on that a little bit, then it's also fascinating, kind of just the decentralization and how that then can be combined with the smart home and these applications that we need. Because we know that there's only going to be increasing demands on, for example, healthcare. And it is important to individuals, whatever shape or form, it's always going to be relevant. But how can we bring it closer to individuals? And I feel also like this rudimentariness of the applications. I mean, not just in healthcare, but just to give you a very selfish point, from our point of view, then, I mean, we've created this ecosystem where you can now, without any servers or logs, play, for example, Battleship between the different types of, developers. And that's great. But at the same time, these types of applications that we've got, then what is the next thing? Because the protocols are the same. That if you have essentially the app going to the individual or then the app going to the home and then really forming this ecosystem, then the way that I see essentially getting there is just removing the friction. That if you can take the friction away from essentially being able to orchestrate this and being able to get something off the ground, then you'll have the expiration. And that's kind of where you can get to this. All right. So thank you guys so much for joining me here. And then, I mean, we're definitely want to continue the discussion. So send us any type of comments, any questions, anything that comes afterwards. You can find more information surely on Twitter and elsewhere, and then through the event descriptions as well. But thank you guys for being on. Thank you, Kathy, Martinez, and Vic. It's a pleasure. So we'll conclude here, and everybody have a fantastic rest of your day.